Greetings, my intellectual comrades. Welcome to this edition of Pan-African Digest. Today's podcast is based on one of my blog posts with the title, Why Did African Elite Declare War on History? Today's question is not merely an academic exercise. It is an indictment. It is a summon, an invitation to confront one of the greatest betrayals ever committed against the African continent. The question is, why did African ruling elite declare war on history? The one subject that could have saved the continent from tribalism, xenophobia, and perpetual mental enslavement. Think about it. Of all the subjects that could have disappeared from African classrooms, why history? Why not mathematics? Why not physics? Why not chemistry? No, it was history that had to go. Ladies and gentlemen, accidents do not occur in geopolitics. Nations are programmed, civilizations are engineered. Ignorance can be manufactured, and Africa has become the greatest laboratory of manufactured ignorance in modern history. One of my intellectual mentors, the incomparable Dr. John Henry Clarke, gave us a definition of history that every African child should memorize before learning the alphabet. He said, history is not everything, but it is a compass that guides a people through the uncertain terrain of existence. Pause for a moment and meditate upon that profound statement. A compass, not a decoration. Not a museum piece, a compass. Imagine a captain setting sail across the Atlantic after throwing his compass into the sea. Will you trust him with your life? Of course not. Yet, that is precisely what African political class has done. They deliberately smashed the continent's historical compass and then wondered why generation after generation drifted into storms of dependency, confusion, and identity crisis. History is not about memorizing dates. It is not about reciting the names of dead kings. History is a collective memory. History tells a people who they are. History explains where they have been. History reveals why they occupy their present condition. And history illuminates the road to the future. Take away history, and you do not merely erase the past, you steal the future. Marcus Garvey understood this truth perhaps better than any African leader of the 20th century. That is why he thundered across continents that a people without the knowledge of their history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. A tree without roots does not negotiate with the wind. It simply falls. A river that forgets its source eventually dries up. A civilization that abandons its memory eventually becomes raw material for other civilizations. This is the tragedy of Africa today. Then came one of Africa's greatest scholars, Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, a giant whose scholarship demolished centuries of colonial mythology. For generations, Europe insisted that ancient Egypt belonged somewhere outside Africa. Diop calmly assembled the archaeological, linguistic, anthropological, and scientific evidence. Then he delivered a devastating verdict. Ancient Egypt, Kemet, was African. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but scientifically. But Diop did something even greater. He connected the civilization of the Nile Valley to the civilizations of West Africa. He built an intellectual bridge from Cairo to Dakar, from Kumasi to Khartoum, and from Lagos to Luxor. His masterpiece, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, demonstrated that beneath our hundreds of languages and ethnic identities, lies, and ancient civilization continue. Imagine if every African child studies that book. Would politicians still find it easy to weaponize ethnicity at every election season? Will brothers massacre brothers because colonial administrators drew arbitrary lines on a map in Berlin in 1884? Would xenophobia flourish if Africa understood that our ancestors traded, migrated, intermarried, and built civilizations across this continent centuries before European cartographers invented today's borders? History answers those questions. History exposes those lies. History destroys artificial divisions. That is why it became dangerous. Our musicians understood this long before many professors did. Bob Marley sang history. Peter Tosh proclaimed history. Fela Anikulapo Kuti weaponized history. Marcus Garvey preached history. John Henry Clark interpreted history. Sheikh Anta Diop proved history. History has always been the heartbeat of African Pan-Africanism. Yet Africa's ruling elite look upon this priceless inheritance and pronounce it unnecessary. What monumental foolishness! What breathtaking civilizational illiteracy! Or perhaps we should stop calling it foolishness. Perhaps it was something more sinister. Because ignorance has always been the preferred currency of mediocre rulers. Educated citizens ask uncomfortable questions. Historically conscious citizens refuse manipulation. People who know where they come from are extremely difficult to deceive. Perhaps that is why history had to disappear. Instead, African manufacturer graduates who list the wives of Henry VIII but know nothing about Mansa Musa. They know about Napoleon but not Sundiata Keita. They know about French Revolution but know almost nothing about the Great Zimbabwe. They celebrate Roman civilization but remain strangers to Benin, Songhai, Nubia, and Kemet. What kind of educational system produces Africa who know Europe better than Africa? What kind of civilization deliberately teaches its children to admire someone else's ancestors, while remaining ignorant of their own? Only a conquered civilization, only a mentally colonized civilization. And this mental colonization has consequences. When people know only their tribe, they become prisoners of the tribe. When people know only about colonial borders, they become defenders of colonial borders. When people are unfamiliar with African civilization, they become suspicious of fellow Africans. History enlarges identity. Ignorance shrinks it. History creates continental consciousness. Ignorance manufactures tribal consciousness. History liberates. Ignorance enslaves. This is why removing history from African school was not simply an educational mistake. It was intellectual vandalism. It was cultural sabotage. It was civilizational self-harm. It amputated Africa's memory. And no human being voluntarily amputates its memories and expects to retain its identity. Fellow Africans, Africa's renaissance will not begin in presidential palaces. It will begin in classrooms. It will begin in libraries. It will begin in homes where parents tell their children the stories of African great civilization. Every African child should know that before colonialism, Africa had universities. Before colonialism, Africa had empires. Before colonialism, Africa conducted international trade. Before colonialism, Africa built monumental architecture. Before colonialism, Africa produced philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and systems of governance. That knowledge changes psychology, and psychology ultimately determines destiny. That is why our mission here at Pan-African Digest remains unchanged: to educate, to agitate, to awaken. Because no one is coming to rescue Africa, not Washington, not London, not Paris, certainly not Brussels. Africa must rescue herself, and every great rescue begins with recovering memories. We must therefore demand that history return to every African classroom. We must insist that it occupies its rightful place in every curriculum. We must discuss it in our homes. We must debate it in our university. We must celebrate it in our literature, and we must defend it against those who prefer Africans without memory. For history is far from memory. History is identity. History is resistance. History is dignity. History is liberation. Until Africa discovers her historical compass, she will continue wandering in circles while mistaking perpetual motion for genuine progress. And that, my intellectual compatriots, is today's question of the day. If you find this episode valuable, please subscribe, share it with your fellow Africans, and join this growing movement to educate, agitate, and awaken our continent. Until next time, I'm Femi Akomolafe. Please keep thinking, keep questioning, and above all, never surrender your history. Because the people who control your memory eventually control your destiny. I thank you very much for listening, and please keep on helping us to share our podcast and our blog post. Until next time, I say Ireo.